This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to the Hindus in Focus podcast with me, Amit Barua, your host for this episode. The Labour Party has scored an emphatic victory in the July 4th British general elections, and Keir Starmer is all set to be the new Prime Minister replacing Rishi Sunak. Ending 14 years of Conservative rule, Labour look all set to win about 410 of a total of 650 seats, with Sunak's party way behind at 144, BBC reported. Nigel Farage's anti-immigration reform party won a paltry number of seats, but picked up 14% of the vote. Farage won a seat in Parliament on his 8th attempt. The Liberal Democrats are expected to win 58 seats. Labour's vote percentage only increased by about 4 percentage points over 2019, adding up to a little over 36% of the votes cast. On their part, the Conservatives lost as much as 20% of their vote share from 2019. So what lies ahead for Britain under Starmer? To make sense of the election results, I'm joined from London by Andrew Whitehead, former editor of the BBC's World Service. Welcome to the In Focus podcast, Andy.
Thank you, Amit, and it's great to be back on the podcast with you.
So, Andy, it's been a long night and an early morning start for you. So what are your first thoughts on the results?
I think I'm still thinking, wow, this is big. We did expect a convincing Labour victory, but there's one thing expecting it based on opinion polls, and there's another one when the votes are actually counted and the results are announced, and Labour has got this huge overall majority, one of the biggest parliamentary majorities in modern British history. So I think that's the number one thing. There are lots of other things happening. I do feel a little sorry for Rishi Sunak. His 20 months in power will have to be described as a failure. He's been fairly brutally kicked out. The Conservatives have lost 2/3 of their seats in Parliament and almost half of their share of the vote. So this is a bit of a drubbing for him. Those are my initial thoughts.
So what's your sense? Rishi Sunak has retained his seat, but do you think that this is a vote for Labour, or is it an anti-Conservative vote? What's your sense on that?
Well, as ever, it's a bit of both, but it's more an anti-Conservative vote, I think. There's not a great deal of enthusiasm for either Keir Starmer personally, decent guy, but not charismatic, or for Labour, who have got a very cautious policy programme. So I think it is the Conservatives who've lost this. They have been in power now for 14 years. They've won. Prior to the latest result, they'd won 4 successive general elections. And, governing parties run out of steam after so long in office. They become faction-ridden. They become divided. Sometimes they start to lose touch with the electorate. And I think all these have been problems for the Conservatives. Rishi Sunak took over as Prime Minister, not in an election, but when the party was going through a crisis. Boris Johnson had been forced from office in disgrace, and then his brief successor, Liz Truss, had, she'd basically had a row with the markets, and she also was forced out. But he's never really managed to give the impression of being in charge. He's never brought his party together. He was a fairly competent finance minister, as we call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we call it here, but a really not very good prime minister. And he has been politically inept. He's made a series of really quite astonishingly silly decisions. And his legacy is going to be hugely tarnished as a result.
So what happens now? Just run us through, when will the Sir Keir Starmer take oath? What happens now? I presume the king is involved in this process and so on.
Well, there's no show without the king in this country. So Rishi Sunak is taking leave of the king. He will go to the palace. It's happening very, very shortly, and formally resign. Then an hour or two later, Keir Starmer will go to the palace and the king will formally ask him to form a government. And then Keir Starmer will turn up outside 10 Downing Street. There'll be a lectern there. And he will address the nation from outside 10 Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister. He then goes through the doors into 10 Downing Street and really straight away gets down to work. So as soon as the results come in, within a matter of hours, we have a new Prime Minister.
And Rishi Sunak would have vacated 10 Downing Street by now.
Well, he probably won't have actually packed up all his personal belongings because, of course, 10 Downing Street is not just an office, it's also a home. So that'll probably happen over the weekend. I'm quite sure that they've got the removal vans booked, and Keir Starmer will be not only installed in the office, but in the flat at the top of 10 Downing Street by Monday morning.
So, Andy, I mean, you watched British politics for a long time. You also watched Indian politics as well as the India correspondent of the BBC. So tell us, what is going to change now? Is there going to be a dramatic shift from conservative policies, or is it going to be more of the same?
It's going to be largely more of the same. And this is somewhat ironic because Labour's election slogan was "Time for Change." Now they've won an emphatic victory, and I don't think we're going to see an awful lot of change. So what Keir Starmer has done in his 4 or so years as leader of the Labour Party is he's marginalised the hard left within the Labour Party. He's banished Labour's reputation as a high tax and spend party, and he's tried to give Labour the aura of being consensus-minded and competent. And largely, the electorate have bought into that. And there will be some changes. So Keir Starmer has already made clear he will abandon one of the more curious of Rishi Sunak's policies, which was to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda in Central Africa as a means of discouraging illegal immigration. Keir Starmer has said that's just not going to happen. He will give the green light to a lot of new house building. He will also try and cut the very long waiting lists for treatment in the state-funded health service. But all of these are fairly incremental. On foreign policy, I really don't think there's going to be any change at all. So, Britain will remain a strong supporter of Ukraine. It will continue to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, but also maintain links with Israel. Although Keir Starmer was not a Brexiteer, he's made clear he will not seek to take Britain back into the European Union, because that would be too divisive. But the strange thing is, Labour's share of the vote has only slightly increased from the last general election. So it looks as if it's going to be 35% or 36% when absolutely all the votes are counted. That's a sort of minor incremental increase. But with that just modest increase in share of the vote, Labour is going to have twice the number of MPs that it had last time around. And that seems to be because a lot of votes have gone not to Labour or the Conservatives, but to other parties, whether it's the Anti-Immigrant Reform UK, or it's the Greens, or it's the Nationalists, or in some cases to independents who've done quite well in a number of seats because they've said Labour needs to take a stand on Gaza and demand that Israel stops its military action there.
So before I come to foreign policy, there are a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about. Hasn't Labour promised to bring down the voting age to 16 and also to renationalise your railways?
The voting age at the moment is 18, and Labour has said that it will bring it down to 16, and I think it will do that. Not immediately, because there will be a lot for Keir Starmer to deal with, but within the 5 years of his first term in power, I think it will do that. And there's other things that they have said that they will do. Nationalisation of the railways, yes. Whether it'll be a formal nationalisation or it will be a creeping bigger role for the state is not entirely clear. They've also said that they will set up a publicly owned new clean energy company to encourage, to redress climate change. But there won't be a wholesale nationalisation of the economy. And Keir Starmer has made clear that he continues to welcome investment. He wants Britain to remain a business-friendly country.
On the voting age, Andy, has there been a demand that it should be lowered to 16, or is this something a political party wants to do?
I don't think that I haven't spotted teenagers taking to the street saying, let me vote. It's something that Labour is committed to because it wants to in its terms, modernize Britain's democracy. And for many other things, 16 is the key age. So why should it be different for voting? I think there is also going to be a party advantage. So the young tend to be more to the left, more Labour voting than the old. And the Conservatives have made clear that if they had won this election, they would have kept the voting age at 18. They wouldn't have gone for a reduction in the voting age. So there is a little bit of party advantage at play here as well.
Right. So on foreign policy, I mean, one of the independent, you mentioned independents doing well. So one of the independents who's won is Jeremy Corbyn, and who led, Labour to a disastrous defeat. But do you see any significance in his victory?
Well, actually, I live in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency, so I had the chance to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not going to tell you which way I did vote, but he was on my ballot paper.
You're not going to do it.
I'm not going to tell you, no. But he won quite comfortably, rather surprisingly comfortably, actually. I mean, I think people thought he might just win, but to win with a significant, comfortable majority is a bit of a surprise. I think that demonstrates that Keir Starmer's changes to the Labour Party have annoyed quite a lot of people. And Jeremy Corbyn was very outspoken as, in his words, a champion of the people of Gaza. He basically said that the Israeli military offensive must stop and Britain must be much louder at the United Nations and elsewhere in demanding an end. He's also said that Britain should stop any arms supplies to Israel. And this has won a particular resonance in a part of London where there's a significant Muslim community. And in other parts of the country, in Birmingham, in the northwest, independents have in a few places defeated sitting Labour members of Parliament because of Muslim voters' concern that Labour isn't firm enough on the Gaza issue.
So what's your sense? I mean, Keir Starmer was, under considerable fire for his stand on Palestine/Gaza. And, a lot of people thought that he had even supported the offensive in the early days. So do you think that this election of people like Corbyn and the votes they've got, will it make any difference at all to Labour's policies on Israel?
I think, in a word, no, it won't. The fact that there are people like Jeremy Corbyn in the House of Commons will probably unsettle a few Labour MPs who instinctively are uncomfortable with their party's line. But Keir Starmer has a huge majority. He's not going to be biddable by a few dissonant voices. And he's quite clear that actually, he wants eventually to be able to recognise an independent Palestinian state. But he said he won't do that out on a limb. In other words, if he does that, it will be in conjunction with Britain's allies, and particularly the United States. I don't think he will stop all arms supplies to Israel. I don't think he'll break links with the Israeli government. But I suspect he may be a little more vocal in saying, come on, it is time for a ceasefire, and we've got to put a real emphasis on humanitarian help to all those hundreds of thousands of people who've been displaced in Gaza and are living in such awful conditions.
So is it your sense, Andy, that, we saw Tony Blair, very flamboyant Labour Prime Minister, who really supported the United States to the hilt in the Iraq war. And, we know that the WMD, weapons of mass destruction, turned out to be, fake news. So is it your sense that Keir Starmer will be another Tony Blair, or will he be more independent and, more critical of policies that his electorate might be concerned about?
I think in some ways, Keir Starmer will be even more cautious than Tony Blair when it comes to foreign policy. I think he will stick very much to America's coattails. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the presidential election. If Donald Trump comes back, that may cause a little bit of tension. But Keir Starmer has already said that he'll work with whoever is elected. If we get a hard-right prime minister in France, he'll work with that person. If Donald Trump comes back in the States, he will work with President Trump. So I think it'll be a cautious foreign policy. I don't think we're going to see any boldness, to be blunt about it, in foreign policy. But in terms of the comparison with Tony Blair, Tony Blair had charisma. He also had clear political vision. He knew what he wanted to do with the country. And on a whole range of issues, education, health, Northern Ireland, he was almost visionary. And Keir Starmer's not like that. He's not charismatic. He's competent. He's a person of integrity, a lawyer, but he's not going to rock the boat. It's going to be a gentle process of change rather than dramatic change. And I think a lot of people are still wondering what really is his political vision. Because, as I said, it's not so much that Labour has won as the Conservatives and Rishi Sunak have lost.
So on the issue of immigration, you did mention that, he's going to junk Rishi Sunak's policy to send some illegal immigrants to Rwanda. But what is your sense with, Nigel Farage's, Reform Party getting 14% of the vote? Do you think he's going to be under pressure, just like the Conservatives were in a sense? And, is it going to mean that Keir Starmer will also steer a very careful path, walk a tightrope on the issue of immigration?
Well, Keir Starmer's already said that he wants to ensure that there are fewer immigrants to Britain, and that's both legal and illegal immigrants. So at the moment, we have in net terms about 500,000 immigrants coming to Britain every year. And that's historically a very high level. And on top of that, about 50,000 illegal immigrants coming to the country. And Keir Starmer has said he wants to get both figures down. I mean, some on the left of his party aren't very comfortable with the language that Keir Starmer has used. And he certainly, during the election campaign, caused great offence to the Bangladeshi community by suggesting that there was a big problem of illegal immigration from Bangladesh, which actually there isn't. But the success of Reform UK in getting about 15% of the vote, even if just a handful of MPs, is a very potent reminder to everyone across the political spectrum that immigration is a hot issue, and many voters remain deeply concerned about the level of immigration and want that level to be brought right down.
So is it, in your view, you live in Britain, you've seen the politics of the country closely. So is it the level of immigration that is concerning people, or is it that, people just don't like outsiders to come? There are all these issues, and we've seen, globally, there is a growing intolerance of the other, so to speak, in your own country.
There certainly are some people who don't like the idea of more outsiders, more people who don't necessarily share traditional British values and cultures as they would see it. But I think that's a very small part of the concern about immigration. I think there is a general sense that actually Britain cannot sustain taking an additional net 500,000 migrants every year. And there's also a sense that actually those people who are coming illegally in small boats across the channel are sort of jumping the queue in a sense. That's not fair. That's not right. So I think both of those are quite deeply held sentiments. So, there were one or two racist barbs about Rishi Sunak during the campaign, but broadly, I think people across Britain and across the political spectrum are rather proud that Britain has had a person of colour as Prime Minister. And it's demonstrated that race is not a barrier in Britain anymore to getting the top political job. And indeed, there are people of Indian heritage who are likely to be competing to take over from Rishi Sunak as the next leader of the Conservative Party. So it's not simply racism and xenophobia. There's a bigger concern than that. We're a nation of 70 million people. So taking an extra 500,000 people each year, that's a lot. That's, almost 1% population increase through immigration every year. I am concerned about how it will be done. I'm also concerned about, Britain's economy needs migrants. Britain's health service needs migrants. It needs qualified doctors and nurses to cope with the increasing demand. And I'm slightly surprised and sad that Keir Starmer has been so willing to insist that immigration, he's giving the message that immigration is a bad thing. And I think many people in Britain would say immigration has been of huge benefit to this country.
I was going to ask you about the Scottish National Party and his performance, but before that, I just want to ask you. So, how have people of Indian origin or South Asian origin done in these elections?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a detailed readout of that. It is conspicuous that there are more people of Indian heritage in politics now than there were a decade ago, but quite a lot. And within the Conservative Party, Suella Braverman, who's on the hard right of the party, who is of Goan heritage, she has been re-elected, and she's almost certainly going to be among those seeking to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. In Labour's ranks, a little bit less clear-cut. So Jeremy Corbyn's success in the constituency where I live was at the expense of a Labour candidate who is of Indian heritage. So it's a mixed picture. It did look as if, very large, 1.7 million or more people of Indian community in Britain was moving right towards the Conservative Party. I think this election has seen that trend at least paused. The opinion poll evidence I saw during the campaign was that Labour might actually get more votes of people of Indian heritage than the Conservatives. But I think the contribution of Indians in British politics will remain high profile in the new parliament. Not quite as high profile as when you have an Indian prime minister, of course, but nevertheless, they are going to be across the board. And for all the major parties, people of Indian heritage will be prominent at the top levels of politics.
And what do you think this former prime minister of Indian heritage will do now? He's quite young.
He is quite young. Is I think 44. He, of course, has been re-elected as a member of parliament, and he has said he will stay on as an MP. He's also said he will, there's been a lot of speculation about whether he would leave the country and go and move to California. He has a home in California as well as one in London and in his constituency in the north of England. He's insisted he will stay in Britain. When things calm down, I really do wonder. Well, I don't think he's got much of a future in politics. I don't think he will return to the top level of politics. I don't think he will want to be a backbench member of parliament for long. So my suspicion is that, within whether it's months or a few years, or maybe at the time of the next election, he will bow out of politics and he will go back to making a lot of money, probably in finance.
Okay, so Andy, now I want to turn towards the performance of the Scottish National Party. They've fared really badly and Labour's done very well. What do you think are the reasons for that?
Well, the SNP, of course, still form the devolved government. So the First Minister in Scotland is still a Scottish nationalist, but you're absolutely right. They've had a very bad showing in this election to the Westminster Parliament. Why is that? I think partly it's because the SNP has been caught up in some really quite serious scandals. It's lost two leaders over the past couple of years. Its former chief executive has been charged with embezzlement. He insists he's innocent, but nevertheless, it's not a very good look, is it, when such a senior former official is charged with irregularities of that sort? And I think also there's something more than that. I don't think people in Scotland could see a route to gaining independence in the near term. The only leverage the SNP has got at Westminster is if there's a hung parliament, and their votes really count. Starmer's majority is huge. He doesn't need SNP support in Westminster, and that was fairly obvious for quite some time. So the independence card has not been very effective in this election. And if independence isn't the big issue, then the nationalists aren't going to get very many votes.
Before I let you go, Andy, I just want to ask you, we are seeing a rightward shift in the politics of Europe. We also see, you also mentioned that Starmer doesn't want to reopen the issue of Brexit at all. So what is your sense? 14%, 15% of the vote going to someone, the Reform Party. Is this suggestive of a broader shift towards the right, not just in the UK, but what we're seeing in France and in other countries? And even, some might say that even the intolerance shown in Germany to political protests these days is perhaps suggestive of the same trend.
I don't think so, actually. I don't think you can liken Reform UK to the Le Pen hard right in France. I think there's something else happening. It's really quite conspicuous that if you add together Labour and Conservative votes, that only accounts for 60% of those votes cast. So in total, 4 out of 10 of people who voted for parties other than Labour and the Conservatives. Some of that certainly went to Reform UK, but it went to the Liberal Democrats, it went to the Nationalists, it went to the Greens, it went to independent candidates, a whole range of things happening there. And I think that is about a loss of trust in politicians and conventional political parties. And I think that's happening in many of the major democracies. I think it's happening in France, in Germany, and the United States. But I don't think that the relatively strong showing of Reform UK suggests that Britain is slipping to the right. In fact, what we are doing in fairly sort of straightforward terms is we're moving away from a right of centre prime minister to a left of centre prime minister. So while France and the United States seem to be heading right, Britain seems to be heading left, at least for the moment.
Thank you so much, Andrew Whitehead, for talking to the Hindus in Focus podcast and giving us these insights about, what's going to happen and what the picture looks like from London. I'm deeply grateful to you.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Amit.
Thank you so much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.